They were barely 20 years old when the decision had already been made. No judge, no jury, no warning, just a bitter winter morning and a man who couldn't look her in the eye. He set down 2 trail packs, said the town couldn't feed everyone. Her sister heard every word and was already lacing her boots. No goodbyes were spoken. Neither girl had a single farewell left in her hardened soul. They walked north, straight into the driving white. They were barely 20 years old when the settlement folks decided they had to go. No judge, no jury, no warning. Just a bitter cold winter morning when their own uncle showed up on the porch, 2 heavy trail packs already stuffed full. His jaw set hard as granite, while the whole dirt street peeked through iced-up glass. Maeve Winter stared at folks she had known since she was a sprout, realizing a hard truth that would ache like a bullet wound for years. Being dead right was always the most dangerous thing about them girls. Tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and stick with me here, because you and I are riding this wild frontier tale to the bitter end. That freezing morning, Maeve was crushing dry corn at the pine table when she heard a heavy rap. Wasn't a polite tap either. More like a heavy fist pounding the timber. 3 hard strikes. Final. The kind a man throws when his mind is locked up tight and he ain't taking back talk. Maeve knew her uncle's heavy hand right away. She had known that pounding since she was 7, with their poor mother just 3 months buried in the dirt. Her sister, Clara, was still asleep, or just playing possum. That was a quiet difference between the two that only Maeve ever picked up on. Clara could turn still as a dried creek bed when trouble rolled in, hiding in pure silence while the thunder boomed. Meanwhile, Maeve would march straight into the dust storm, eyes wide and jaw locked tight. To the eye, them twins looked exactly alike, but deep down in the bone, they were exact opposites of each other. Maeve dropped her heavy grinding stone, wiped her dusty hands on her skirt, and yanked the door open. Her uncle, Silas Winter, stood out on that icy porch. 2 supply sacks sat at his boots, 4 inches of fresh snow resting on his hat. He was a mountain of a man, broad in the shoulders, wearing a face leathered so bad you could not read his thoughts. Silas was not always a hard man. She remembered a younger version of him from childhood. A fellow who used to laugh at the supper table. A man who called her late mother by a sweet, gentle campfire nickname. But that soft man vanished the day he took in 2 orphan girls the whole settlement was already spreading nasty rumors about. "Winter is brutal," he grumbled, refusing to meet her eyes. He stared off over her shoulder instead. "Worse freeze than any I have survived in 30 years. Rations in the storehouse will not feed everyone." Maeve stayed quiet. The town council gathered late last night, still avoiding her gaze. 3 frontier families already lost kids to the frost. Folks reckon the bad fever is creeping up from the valley. "I know," she answered. "I told the town elders 2 weeks ago the wheat rations were counted wrong. I laid out the math for them." Silas ground his teeth. "Folks out here hate looking at hard math, Maeve. This town is starving, whether they like your accounting or not." "That right there." He paused, taking a long breath. "That is exactly the stubbornness I mean." He finally glanced down at the trail bags, forced himself to look. Watching him, she could see this betrayal was eating him up inside. But clearly not eating him enough to stop. "I loaded up what supplies I could spare," he mumbled. "Fall seeds a hunting blade, 2 thick wool blankets the hatchet, and enough jerky to last you 5 days, stretching it. And if we ride hard, then maybe 3 days." Maeve burned a hole through him with her stare. Picture it with me. A 20-year-old girl, shoved out into a deadly winter blizzard, her neighbors just watching her go. She thought of dropping a hard truth on him. Words sharp enough to bust right through that tough cowboy armor he wore to do this awful deed. She even thought to ask if he still pictured her mother's face, or that holy promise he swore back at the graveyard. But she swallowed it down. "Let me go rouse Clara," she muttered, stepping back into the cabin. Clara was wide awake. She sat right on the mattress edge, riding boots, laced up, heavy duster resting across her knees. Her dark eyes burned steady in the dim morning light, sneaking through the frozen window pane. She heard the whole thing. "How far?" she asked. "Far enough that we never ride back here." Clara just stared down at the tough leather coat. For a split second, pain flashed across the girl's face. Then she stood tall and threw that heavy coat on. That right there was what Maeve loved and hated most about Clara. Once she made a choice, her boots were glued to the path. No looking backward. Once she took a step, she committed to that wild trail. Maeve always second-guessed things. Guess that is why she was the brains of the outfit, while her sister was the one built for surviving. The two of them stepped out side by side, always did. Silas stood frozen on the porch. Out in the dirt, the four neighbors who formed the gathering crowd stood stone still too. Mrs. Clay crossed her arms tight over her chest. The Priestley boys stood side by side like warped fence posts, and Old Man Holt leaned heavy on his stick, his face showing a sliver of pity, but mostly just pure relief. Now these exact folks ate bread from flour Maeve milled. They took her farming advice, then quietly thanked the good weather for their heavy harvests. You and I know they snuck their sick calves to Clara when nobody was looking. Slowly, Maeve hoisted up one of the heavy packs. Weighed a ton. Whatever else Silas Winter might be, the man knew how to pack supplies right. Clara grabbed the other load. No goodbyes were spoken. At that bitter moment, neither girl had a single farewell left in her hardened soul. Clara eyed those four locals in the dirt exactly how a rider sizes up a broken fence line they already planned to ride right past. Maeve studied her uncle's face one final time, that tired, slightly crooked face of his committing his grim expression right into her permanent memory. Not forgetting even. She just needed to remember the exact look of a man choosing the easy trail over doing what was actually right. Then they turned their boots north, straight into the driving white. The blizzard slammed them before they even cleared the timber, been brewing thick since sunup. It had that heavy quiet dropping before a bad squall. The birds go dead silent. The air pulls tight, and the ground snow just seems to brace for impact. Maeve caught the scent of it at daybreak, kept quiet though. No point wasting breath on it. The squall was coming anyway, and they were marching into it regardless. That northern trail out of Dunmore Hollow followed an old creek bed for 2 miles, then cut straight up into the high pines. On clear days, it was a fair enough route for fur trappers and stray surveyors. Buried under 2 hard feet of fresh snow, with freezing powder blowing sideways from the northwest following it, became pure guesswork and blind luck. Clara took the lead. She always had a sharper instinct for wild country. Let me tell you, she read a stretch of rough dirt the same way you and I might read a man's face. She never faltered, even when a smart traveler would pause. She planted every single boot like a blood oath, while Maeve walked right in her tracks, trying hard to think. She carried a map. Well, strictly speaking, not hers. She found it tucked inside their mother's old papers, a hand-sketched geological chart of the high peaks, inked by a prospector named Calder Voss, hired by some Eastern mining outfit back in the early 1850s. Those city folks found absolutely zero ore worth digging out of the dirt, so they packed up, and that old chart ended up shoved into the back pages of her mother's farming journals. Maeve had studied it 40 times. She had this stubborn habit of burning ink into her brain until it lived there, meaning she never needed to check the paper twice. Folks back in the Hollow found that mighty unnatural, but Maeve just called it efficient thinking. That faded parchment mapped out a rugged string of deep ravines hiding in the far northwest corner of those jagged peaks. One canyon carried a curious scrawl she had wrestled with for years. Warm rock formation limestone, possible geothermal venting. Old Calder Voss was busy hunting heavy ore. He did not give a damn about warmth. But Maeve spent 2 long years chewing on what those words actually meant for survival. She always filed away wilderness knowledge that might save her hide down the trail, hoarding facts like dried saddle provisions for a treacherous journey she never knew she would have to ride. Well, she was riding it today. "Northeast!" she yelled over the roaring wind. "Past the second ridge!" Clara never slowed or looked back. You certain? I'm certain of the old ink. Just not sure of the actual translation. That's honest, anyway. Not exactly a warm blanket, though. Nope, Clara hollered back. Just keep up. They marched for 6 punishing hours. The blizzard choked them as they climbed upward. The freezing air didn't feel like weather anymore. You and I know the feeling when a dark mountain simply decides it wants you dead. By hour 3, Maeve's left hand went completely numb. She spent a whole brutal mile fighting her frozen mitten, squeezing her fingers until the hot, stinging pain finally rushed back. Clara wore a gash on her chin, courtesy of a heavy pine branch swinging back on the trail. She just kept swiping it away with the back of her hand, careless-like, as if the bleeding didn't matter no more. Now these two only talked sometimes. Let me tell you, they weren't the sorts to fill up silence, just spoke in patches right when the quiet started, letting their own thoughts roar a bit too loud. "Remember when Papa's roan busted into the grain shed?" Clara asked, breaking one of them long, flat stretches of snow. "You let him in," Maeve countered. "It wasn't on purpose. I was only 7. 7 and mighty curious to see if horses had a taste for fermented mash. Turns out they do. They like it a whole lot." "I know. I saw the mess after," Clara chuckled. Just a breathy little sound the winter wind snatched up right away. Papa was boiling mad, kept twitching them heavy eyebrows. Nan had loud eyebrows for a quiet fella. Mama, though, she just laughed till she wept. Tried hiding it, but she was awful at it. The quiet settling over the girls after that felt completely different. Maeve just let it hang. "Been thinking," Clara finally muttered. "About what?" "How neither of us shed a tear back yonder." Maeve chewed on that thought a while. Would crying have changed a damn thing? No. Might have made us look less spooky, though. I'd call it unaffected. Clara cast a look over her shoulder. "Reckon those mean the same thing to folks around here." "We sure ain't unaffected." "I know. Just..." She stopped stepping over a snow-buried trunk. "Keep trying to reckon if I'm purely angry or just broken-hearted. Can't rightly spot the fence line between 'em right now." Maeve pictured their uncle's cold stare on that porch, staring at the empty air beside her head instead of her eyes. Their gear bags already strapped tight when he showed up, meaning he'd done the packing the night before, sleeping under the same roof, perfectly aware what ugly betrayal the sunrise would bring. "Both," she finally answered. "I reckon it's both at once. That's the truth folks never warn you about. Stick with me here. That first ridge was an absolute bear. The second proved even meaner. Coming down that far slope, the sky turned a flat, dusty gray, warning they had maybe 2 hours tops before the sun dipped out completely, and both girls were trudging with that slow, guarded rhythm you only get from bone-deep exhaustion. Not the crying kind wanting pity, but the gritty frontier survival kind that knows the trail don't care, pacing itself to survive. Maeve dug the surveyor's map from her heavy coat, damp around the edges despite the oilskin pouch, her freezing fingers fumbling the paper, but she could still make out the ink. She held it up to the fading light, lining up those rough markings with the wild country up ahead. The canyon ought to be right here. "Left," she barked. "Down through that heavy timber. Ought to be a creek bed." Clara pulled up, studying the woods. Those spruce were ancient giants wrapped in coal-black bark, bottom branches buried under 5 solid feet of drift rising out of the snow, like pillars holding up a ghost town church. Between them, trunks the earth dropped fast. "You certain about this?" "More than I was an hour back. See this rock outcrop?" She pointed toward a bare granite wall 20 yards right. "Lines up perfect with Voss's survey sketch. He rode through here. We're standing on the mark, but the actual gorge won't know till we step inside." Clara sized up that timber for 3 long heartbeats. Maeve watched her sister tally the odds. "Then we push in," Clara said. Boom. They damn near walked past it. That canyon mouth wasn't some grand cavern opening up in the dirt like Maeve figured. No wide split in the stone, Just a mean little squeeze between two limestone walls, half choked by the winter snow. You'd march right on by if you didn't know the trail. Clara only caught it by spotting a tiny detail her sister overlooked. The powder piled up against that crack wasn't laying down quite like the fresh snow out on the main ridge. It lay a bit shallower. Something underneath was stirring it. Heat, Clara muttered, and Maeve felt that spark like a match hitting dry tinder. Now picture this with me. They squeezed sideways through that tight rock, gear scraping loud until the gorge finally opened. Wasn't massive, maybe 40 feet across at its widest. Limestone walls shooting up 30 feet, guarding a dirt floor packed with dry leaves, completely untouched by the western snowstorms outside. Whatever powder made it inside just lay thin and patchy. Listen here, friend. The air down in that draw felt different. Wasn't exactly hearth warm, mind you, but that biting winter chill just flat out broke, kind of like stepping out of a freezing river into a quiet, sun-warmed spring. Those rock walls held it. The dirt below was humming with something unseen. Maeve drops to one knee, pressing her bare palm down. She yanked that thick hide, mitten off before she even thought twice about it. Hand flat against the dirt. It wasn't freezing, the ground wasn't cold at all. She locked eyes with Clara, who was already staring right back at her. Neither of them said a single word for a long minute, 'cause when you stumble onto something that mighty, talkin' just feels foolish. You don't go gabbin' while a miracle's unfolding. You make damn sure it's real first. Walk the perimeter, Maeve told her. They walked that edge, separate-like, dragging their hands along the rock walls, pressing palms to stone, paying real close attention. That deep earth heat wasn't even though. It blew stronger up toward the north end of the draw, where that pale limestone cut deep, and the rock face carried a faint mineral scent, sharp and clean. The kind of smell Maeve knew meant deep, untouched earth. They spotted a natural shelf of stone, maybe 10 feet wide and 15 feet long, hugging that west wall that caught heat rising from below, hiding them right out of the biting wind. Up near the north end, the dirt dipped down into a hollow, sat right under the warmest stretch of rock. Last summer's brush was dead now, sure, but thick and tightly matted. Proved to her that plants grew here long past what's normal for this high mountain elevation. And tucked deep inside that northern alcove, right where the pale stone folded back on itself, sat the barely visible mouth of a cavern. Maeve had to press her face right near the rock just to spot it. Without even looking back, she reached out and snatched Clara's sleeve. Right here, she muttered. Clara leaned past her shoulder, staring straight into that pitch black. How deep does she run? Don't know yet. The two women just traded a long, hard look. Gonna need a fire to see, Clara said. Yep. And sparking a flame in there will tell us mighty quick if we've got decent breathing air. Clara stood up straight. She went quiet a spell. In that stretch, Maeve watched her sister's face do that old familiar thing she always did, chewing through every option, every deadly risk, all the rough math, without showing a lick of it on the surface, just a tight pinch round her eyes that Maeve had learned to read like a trail map over 20 years. Strike the fire, Clara said. I'll track the smoke. Her old flint and steel sat right at the bottom of Maeve's pack, swaddled up in a square of dry hide that kept the worst of that brutal mountain dampness at bay. She gathered a little tinder from the dry leaves on the cavern floor. Plenty of crisp kindling down there, kept bone dry beneath the top layer by that steady heat rising right through the stone. 3 solid strikes later, she finally caught a good flame. She held it high, tracking the trail. That gray smoke drifted away from them, slow and steady, pulled right toward the back of the cavern. Air's moving, she stated. Natural draft, Clara replied right behind her. That's a natural draft. Gotta be another way out deeper inside. Crack in the stone, most likely. Now, picture this with me. They stood at the cavern's maw with that tiny flame dancing, and the darkness stretched back way further than any firelight could ever touch. Looked to be 60 feet, maybe more. Roof sat high enough to stand up straight. Floor was rough, sure, but easy to walk. Walls stayed dry. That pale stone felt just like weathered cattle bone. And from somewhere up ahead, deep down in the mountain's own rocky belly, came that faint, steady heat that had been waiting there all along. Clara spoke up, real quiet. "We are gonna live through this." Wasn't a question. Wasn't exactly a hard statement neither. Settled right somewhere in the dusty middle. It's what you say when you've kept your hope locked up for miles because you couldn't afford to be dead wrong, and finally the frontier gives you enough proof to believe. Maeve stayed dead silent. She just tossed a dry branch onto the flames and watched it grow. Outside, up above that ridge, the howling blizzard was busy swallowing the whole wide world. Heavy snow was wiping out the trail they'd cut, the tracks they'd left, and the memories of the folks who'd watched them ride out. You and I know the wild don't care. That mighty mountain stayed completely indifferent, warm in its hidden pockets, just doing the ancient, stubborn work of being stone. Deep inside the cavern, the fire caught and held. They toiled till their eyes failed, slept hard, then got right back to it. Those first 48 hours were strictly practical, the way frontier survival demands. Wasn't a lick of time for anything but the immediate, deadly threat. And out there, that meant securing fire, solid shelter, clean water, and taking a hard, honest inventory of the gear they had left. Pull up a chair, friends. Less than an hour inside that cave, Maeve already had their stash memorized. She ran through those survival packs like a mill grinding corn, cold, steady, and dead practical. 2 heavy wool blankets, 5 days of dried jerky, 3 if they ate foolishly, which these 2 certainly weren't going to do. 1 lean blade, a trusty little hatchet, a good stretch of rope, a tin cup, some flint, and their territory map. Plus their late mother's little notebook. Maeve had shoved it into the bag on pure gut instinct, right before the hard truth of their frontier exile truly hit her bones. But those seeds meant pure survival. Old Silas handed over seeds from the autumn harvest, and the man didn't mess around. They had little packets of squash winter rye, some hardy turnips, and a tiny paper twist holding an old strain of cavern moss. It was the exact same kind their mother used to tinker with years back, trying to see if it would grow inside. Maeve just stared at that little packet. She couldn't tell if her uncle slipped it in on purpose or if it was plain luck. She figured it hardly mattered now. "Rye goes first," Clara declared upon seeing it. "If this dirt takes to the natural underground heat at all, rye sprouts the toughest out here." "I know," Maeve interrupted. "I ain't doubting your judgment. I'm just thinking out loud. Sounds exactly the same. Maybe to your ears." Clara grabbed the packet of rye, rolling it over in her dusty hands. "That hollow up north, where all those dead weeds are resting. We plant there first." "Fair enough, but that wild dirt needs fixing. It's way too thick with clay. We need wall limestone and canyon leaves." "Yep. Gotta balance the soil." Clara shot her a look. "You've been plotting this since we left." "I've been planning this since I was 16, reading Voss's old frontier surveys on repeat." "You never told me." Maeve paused on that. "I figured you'd try to talk me out of believing this place was even real." Clara went dead quiet for a spell. You could see the wheels turning in her head. Finally, "I wouldn't have." "Well, I know that now." Heavy history sat between those girls, buried right under the surface of their words. That classic puzzle of why Maeve kept secrets. Was it frontier caution, pure fear, or just an old shield she hadn't put down yet? They let that sleeping dog lie. The damp chill was still biting their bones. The fire needed feeding. Daylight was burning away, and they had a mountain of chores ahead. Still, the truth had been spoken. Those quiet words just hung around the campsite like wood smoke for the rest of the night. Not an awkward feeling, just present. Rigging up a sturdy camp inside that rock took 4 rough days. They started with absolutely zero timber. Maeve tackled that problem straight on. She spent the second morning swinging her hatchet at a thicket of dead birch timber she spotted along the eastern canyon wall. Those birch trees had died right there, and seasoned perfectly, standing up. Now, you and I might call that a lucky break. Or maybe that strange geothermal heat just bakes the soil and messes with nature's normal rules. She didn't waste daylight pondering on it. She just chopped the wood and hauled it all inside. Meanwhile, Clara spent her morning wrestling heavy stones from the canyon floor. She stacked them up the western ridge, building a solid rock windbreak that would soak up the campfire's heat. These girls were no expert builders. Maeve knew that and spoke up. "We ain't aimin' to be fancy carpenters," Clara grunted, tying a tough brace between two timber stakes with a piece of cut rope. "We just need a roof that won't crush our skulls at midnight." Two entirely different goals. Well, that left side is leaning 2 inches out of plumb. Then we'll just slant everything to the right. Quit staring at me and build the roof. That roof was just thick branches laid heavy and tight, pinned down by stones, tilted enough to run off whatever stray water drifted through the cave mouth. I'll be honest, no educated city engineer was going to hand them a medal for it. But it blocked out that bitter draft and trapped the warmth from their campfire underneath. Out in the wild, that's exactly what a good shelter does. That very first night under their roof, Maeve lay flat on a bed of packed, dry leaves. She stared up at that rough timber ceiling, feeling an emotion bubbling up that she couldn't quite put a name to at first. She rolled the feeling around in her head, examining it from every side, just to be completely sure. Listen to me now. It was pure satisfaction, a mighty rare feeling out on the frontier. Now, it wasn't happiness. Happiness is a whole different beast, and she sure wasn't claiming it just 2 weeks into their banishment. Holed up in a cave with just 5 days of jerky left, staring down a winter that was only fixin' to get meaner. But satisfaction, that's a far cry from being happy. Satisfaction is that deep bone feeling of using your own sweat and grit to wrestle a real problem to the ground and coming out on top. She reckoned it was about the only feeling a body can hold on to when the cards are stacked against you. The hand doesn't need to be good. You just gotta play it right. She turned her gaze to Clara, who'd already drifted off, breathing slow and steady, one hand curled under her chin. She looked peaceful. A rare sight. Considering awake, she was like a restless Mustang, always pacing, eyeing the horizon, moving. Sleep was the only thing that could hobble her. Maeve stared back at the rock ceiling. The cave felt warm. The fire burned steady. Those heirloom seeds sat safe in their canvas packs against the stone, just biding their time for dirt that wasn't properly broke in yet. She shut her eyes. Now let me tell you about this greenhouse. That's what folks would eventually call it, even if it started out uglier than a mud fence. It kicked off as an 8-foot patch of raw dirt tucked back in the northern hollow of that cave. Maeve was dead right about all that heavy clay. That native dirt was cold and packed tighter than a drum, held heat fine, but roots couldn't bust through without some serious doctoring. They spent 3 long days hauling, chipping limestone grit right off the cave walls with a hatchet, dragging dead leaves up from the gully, and mixing campfire ash with water to sweeten the ground. Clara mostly worked that harsh earth bare-handed, folding all that medicine in, layer by layer, turning it with the quiet patience of a farmer who knows damn well that rushing the plow only makes for a longer harvest. "My hands are going to look like a weathered old woman's hands by springtime," she said on the second day. It wasn't really a complaint, just a quiet, hard trail reckoning. "They already look like the hands of a working woman," Maeve called out from behind the hatchet. "That ain't the same thing." In every way that mattered out here, it sure was. Clara tossed a piece of limestone grit her way. Maeve ducked it without even looking up. They sowed that winter rye first, just like they planned, dropping 12 seeds to the square foot, a fair bit shallower than you'd like, seeing as that tough dirt wasn't deep enough yet hugging the warmest stretch of the rock wall to steal a little of that deep earth heat. Then came the turnips, set further back in the chilly outer rows where hardy root crops could thrive on that sharp drop in temperature. They held off on the squash. Squash demands elbow room and rich earth, and they wouldn't see that until the rye sprouted, and those roots did the heavy lifting of busting up the clay. That stubborn cave moss got planted last in a shallow ditch scratched right at the foot of the warmest rock. Using less dirt than the rest, and a heavier dose of water, their mama had scribbled down in her old ledger that cave moss didn't rightly need much of either, that above all else, it was persistent. She'd underlined the word plain as day, which wasn't her usual style. Then they just waited. Now waiting out here is its own harsh labor. They were never sitting idle. There was far too much frontier living to do for that. But the days took on a different rhythm with the planting finally done. They shored up their camp, cobbling together a rock-lined ditch to funnel a tiny trickle of groundwater straight into a handy little catch basin scouted out the deep, dark belly of that whole cavern, and learned it stretched back 112 feet, hiding a second room that caught high noon sun through a crack in the roof. And they talked. More than they had in a month of Sundays. Back in Dunmore Hollow, they'd learned the hard way to mind their tongues and watch who was listening where jawing with neighbors was like riding a horse through a treacherous box canyon. Out here, there were no snags except what the stone itself presented, and rock is nothing if not honest. So the talking flowed freely. Dust got blown off old grudges. Long-buried memories saw the light. Their mama's name echoed around the fire more than once. Not just mourning, though the ache was always simmering underneath. You and I know that special way you talk about folks who left a mark, wanting to be dead sure you remember their trail exactly right. Just making sure the years hadn't painted a rosy, false picture. She would have loved this out here, Clara murmured one night, staring into the flames. She'd have been spitting mad about the poor dirt. Maeve shot back. Clara let out a genuine, belly-deep laugh, completely wide open. You got that right. Let me tell you, she'd have spent that first week scribbling gripes about the soil's alkaline balance in her ledger, and then she'd have fixed it, dead to rights. And then she'd have fixed it, Clara agreed. She went dead quiet for a spell. I think she was afraid of Silas. That word hung in the cold air. Not in the way you'd think, Clara went on. Not afraid for herself, afraid for us. Afraid of what he would decide to do with us if she was gone. A heavy pause followed. I wonder if she knew. Maeve stared into the dying campfire. The old coals sat banked low, doing that slow, stubborn work of holding back the winter chill. She prepared us, she murmured. The journals, the land surveys, the cave moss seeds. She locked eyes with Clara. I think she knew something. Neither soul spoke another word for a long stretch. Then come the 18th day, a tiny green shoot pushed its way up through that hard cave dirt. It was just a little rye seedling, pale and spindly from the shadows, leaning hard toward the faint glow of the cave entrance. But it was breathing, genuinely surviving in ground that any sensible frontiersman would tell you was dead as dust. Clara spotted it first at dawn. She called Maeve over, keeping quiet about what she had actually found. Just come here. Maeve walked over, hitched down low beside the dirt patch, and stared at that little sprout for a good long spell. No bigger than a thumbnail. But it was the most important thing she had ever laid eyes on out there. Adjust the reflector, she whispered, her voice trembling just a hair. They had patched together some polished tin from a supply pack liner, angling it against the rock to bounce that faint sunlight right onto their little garden. Angle it another 10 degrees. It needs more. I know, Clara said, already moving her boots. Outside, that savage blizzard they had been watching brew for 3 days finally broke hard over the mountain ridge. The gale smashed against the canyon walls, howling like a wild dog, stacking snowdrifts so high they would bury the lower branches of the spruce trees by dawn. That bitter winter cold locked down absolutely everything it could touch. But deep inside that cavern, one stubborn rye sprout kept leaning toward the light. The sisters worked their claim. That little seedling held its ground. Now you and I might call it a miracle, but Maeve refused the word. She called it proof of some geothermal gradient theory. Sure, she was right. But Clara shot back that being right didn't make the whole thing any less of a marvel. Maeve argued that extraordinary and miraculous were two completely different beasts, while Clara just sighed and called her flat-out impossible. And Maeve claimed she was just being precise. That right there was exactly how. Their fireside talks went whenever things were actually going smoothly. Now things were only going well in that narrow, hard Scrabble sort of way, the kind of well you feel when you are holed up in a dark cavern during the cruelest winter in 30 years, with dwindling rations and absolutely no certainty about anything past the next 48 hours. But that rye was up. 3 more green sprouts pushed dirt in the 48 hours that followed, pale but mighty stubborn, reaching for that tin reflector with the sheer gritty will of things demanding to live. Clara tweaked that shiny tin twice a day, tracking the slant of whatever weak sunshine crept through the cavern mouth, doing her damnedest to give every single sprout a fighting chance. She didn't need asking and never made a fuss. She just handled the chore, recognizing a piece of survival work that needed doing and taking the reins herself. Maeve spent those same hard days working that secondary rock chamber. That back cavern 112 feet deep, with a nasty crack in the ceiling, held some real promise she had been chewing on since they staked it. The gap was tight, maybe 8 inches across at its widest, but it cut straight through the limestone ceiling to the sky above. On a clear afternoon, a real shaft of daylight poured down like a slow stream of cold mountain water. Wasn't a flood of light, but it beat the cave mouth, and shining from dead overhead, it struck the rock floor straight on, dodging that tricky sideways slant that made the main cavern such a nightmare to farm. The real devil of it, though, was the ground. That back cavern floor was a rough limestone shelf split by a nasty crack running due east to west, and the wild dirt packed in there was heavier with clay than the dry northern dip had ever been. Maeve burned 2 whole days, swinging an axe and a sharpened stick whittled from a piece of scrap birch, busting up the meanest chunks of that earth. She worked in fresh amendments, lost her temper twice, and swallowed her pride both times before spitting words she'd regret. Come sundown on the second day, Clara hauled over some grub. A strip of jerky and a tin of that thin, sad broth they brewed by boiling old bones 2 or 3 times over. She took a seat on that limestone ledge, silently watching her sister battle the stubborn dirt for a good long spell. "Your hands are bleeding," she finally muttered. Maeve looked down. Her right palm had busted open along a tough old callus where she had been gripping the digging stick too damn hard. She hadn't even noticed. "It's fine," she said. "Ain't fine. Just ain't lethal. There's a difference." "You sound like me." "Well, I've had 20 years to catch your drift." Clara held out a ragged strip of cloth she'd ripped right off her underclothes. "Let me bind that." Maeve sat, letting Clara work. Her hands were fast capable, but not soft. Clara wasn't a gentle soul by any stretch. No campfire comfort to her, but she was mighty careful. Out here, careful keeps you alive. She pulled that bandage tight and tucked the tail under, no fuss about it. "That back cave is gonna work," Maeve said. "I know. The sunbeam is stronger than I figured. If that crack runs true, we'll get high noon sun right on the bed." Clara just stared at her. "I know. I sided with you on that back cavern day 1. You don't gotta sell me." Maeve fell quiet a spell. "I ain't trying to sell you. Just thinking out loud." "I know." Clara handed her a tin of broth. "Drink this before it chills." It was already cold. Maeve drank anyway. "Sushi amuba." Now you and I know survival changes a person. Their days caught a rhythm neither woman had ever lived before. Nothing like Dunmore Hollow, with its humming mills, busy market days, and the lazy social circles of a cozy mountain town. Not their childhood, which was built around their mother rising before dawn, working till dusk, and pausing late afternoon to scribble in her dusty old notebooks. This new frontier rhythm was their own making, forged by need and kept by choice. They'd wake when the shadows shifted at the cave mouth, wasn't exactly sunrise, seeing as they were buried deep down that rugged ravine where true dawn never touched, but just that faint morning shift when the pitch black gave way to a dusty gray. They always stoked the campfire first. Fire is the anchor out here. Then came the water. That water seep needed daily chores, clearing small pebbles here, scrubbing mineral grit from the basin there. Then they'd tackle the dirt plots side by side, checking every green shoot, measuring their survival against Maeve's charcoal tally marks on the cavern wall, tilting the light reflector, busting up dirt edges that packed hard as clay. Then came the daily building chore. Always in the middle of a build. Main camp first, then garden plots. Then that back cavern prep, followed by a slew of little odd jobs. Like figuring a better way to stash their seed cache so it stayed bone dry, or rigging hooks on the western rock face for their gear-keeping tools out from under their boots. Woven from dried moss, a second bedroll that was a mighty poor mattress, but let them sleep across the campfire from one another, which they sometimes needed. Clara. She built a stone rack over the flames with their last 3 feet of rope, a place to smoke whatever wild game they could scrounge up. Now, if you and I explored that limestone cavern, we'd expect a few native critters, the odd blind beetle and pale mushrooms on the deep rock. Maeve figured they were safe. To eat, studying them far more carefully than she'd ever let on. Neither would keep them fed. But that wild ravine outside saw animal traffic. Come morning, you'd spot the heavy signatures of jackrabbits, and once, the sly paw prints of a roaming fox. Clara started methodically learning to build snares. She was a lousy trapper so far, and said so without apology. I ain't ever done this. I'm going off Mama's field notes, and I'll tell you, the instructions are mighty lacking. I'm gonna rig this wrong a dozen times before it holds. I know, Maeve said. Just saying, don't go dreaming of a roast tomorrow. I wasn't expecting meat tomorrow. Good. Clara eyed the half-made snare loop. I reckon the tension is off here. The trigger needs to be quicker. Mama's book don't say how quick. Book says fast enough the critter can't react. Hell, that ain't a real measurement. Mama was a dirt scientist, not writing a trapper's guide. She should have been thorough. Maeve almost smiled. She was thorough. Just thorough about the things she actually cared about. Clara eyed that snare. She wanted him to live, sure, but she pictured surviving indoors. You and I know wilderness ain't that kind. Took 8 long days before that trap caught a thing. Come the 9th morning, Clara hiked up from that ravine line, hauling a fresh rabbit. She held it by the hind legs, looked half mighty proud, and half like a greenhorn, choking down the harsh truth of doing what needs doing. The reality of survival always bites a little harder than the romantic idea. First one, she said. Good, Maeve replied. I felt guilty about it for exactly 30 seconds. Sounds about right. Then my stomach growled, and those 30 seconds were over. She offered it forward. You're better with a blade. I'm barely better with a blade. Then put that slide edge to work. I'll tend the fire. By what Maeve reckoned was the 5th week out there, she had been keeping a charcoal tally on the cave wall. 1 heavy scratch a day. And folks, those marks were stacking up. Less like a simple calendar and more like an ironclad testament to grit. The winter rye in their main dirt plot hit 2 inches tall. 2 inches ain't a harvest. Barely a proof of life, but Maeve measured those green shoots on a morning so brutally frozen the bitter chill made every noise outside ring hollow and mighty tight, while that deep ravine sat buried under 4 feet of packed snow. Up above, the howling mountain wind sounded like it was carving the stone itself apart. She measured the crop, scratched a mark in her logbook, and settled back onto the warm dirt floor. Just for a heartbeat, she let the heavy truth of it sink right into her bones. Listen to me now. Those girls were gonna survive the winter. She'd sensed it. Kept that hope at arm's length, though. Banking on things you can't control out in the wild is a fool's gamble, and she couldn't afford to play the fool. But that rye stood 2 inches high, and tough little turnip sprouts were pushing up through the chilly outer edges. Even the cave moss clinging to the heated rock base had taken deep root, spreading in a thick, dark green blanket. Their mother's old journal promised that by spring, it'd yield a solid, never-ending harvest. They weren't going to starve out here. The old cavern was keeping them alive. She opened her notebook again. No survival math this round. She kept numbers in the margins, just words. A rare thing, really. Spilling feelings onto paper always felt a bit too dramatic, like writing letters to ghosts. But she wrote this down anyway. Week 5. Rye at 2 inches. Turnip seedlings breaking dirt in rows 3 and 4. Moss gripping the north wall. Main room holding steady at 11 Celsius. Outside hitting -18. Maybe worse. Clara's trapline snagged 6 rabbits this week. 2 today. We are not going to die here. I need to spell it out twice. We are not going to die here. She didn't write it again, though. Just shut the ledger, tucked it away, and stepped over to help Clara dress out the morning's meat. Now the squash seeds finally hit the backroom dirt on day 41. They'd held those back on purpose. Squash needs space and rich ground. That back cave soil just hadn't been fit for planting until today. 6 solid weeks of turning and feeding the dirt, waking it up from chalky, dead stone dust into ground that yielded under a working hand, ground that finally smelled like real, living earth. Clara seeded a test patch of rye near the edge 3 weeks back. It sprouted a fair bit thinner than the main crop. Caught more sunlight there, but the dirt was still finding its legs. Even so, it grew. That was exactly the green light Maeve was hunting for. They buried the squash in raised mounds, 3 seeds a hill, 4 hills total. Arranged smart so they wouldn't choke out the rye borders. Clara smoothed the final mound and rocked back. She stared up at a stark beam of midday sun cutting down through a rock crack overhead. Right around noon, that light struck dead center on the cavern floor. "That's everything," she muttered. "Every seed we own," Maeve said. "That scare you or settle you?" Maeve chewed on that a second. "Neither one. It's just true." She studied those dirt mounds. "We bet the farm the day we walked away from town, too. We just didn't know the soil yet." Clara shot her a sideways glance. "That borders on poetry." "Keep it quiet." "Who's around to hear it?" Clara stood up, dusting dark earth off her jeans. "We're the only souls on this mountain. Think on that." She tossed the words out light same as always. "But let me tell you, up on that ridge, they settled between them with a weight that wasn't there a month back. 30 days prior, that kind of talk would have tasted like pure danger. Now it was just cold, hard fact. And that fact had a gritty, real edge to it. Wasn't exactly loneliness, wasn't pure freedom either. It was a wild feeling sitting right between the two. Fact was, they were the only living souls left on that mountain. But that untamed mountain was enough for them. Then came day 47, when Clara caught a sound down the ravine. Something that sure wasn't the wind, and wasn't a beast. She'd stepped out past noon, hiking the ridge to run her snare line and rig up 2 empty traps that had been triggered. A sly red fox had been, raiding her sets at night, getting wise to her tricks far too quickly. So she kept shifting those wilderness traps around, fighting to stay 1 step ahead. Deep in the far edge of that rocky draw, she was crouched over her last snare when the sound hit her ears. Footsteps. 2-legged human footsteps. The heavy, unmistakable crunch of a boot pressing hard into packed snow echoing from the rim just above. For 3 long heartbeats, she stayed frozen as stone. Then she sprang up, darting back toward their hidden cave entrance, keeping low and moving fast. And those heavy boots up high, kept right on marching, tracking along the ridgeline. It told her right away this drifter was hugging the high rim instead of taking the easy trail below, meaning they hadn't spotted the entrance. She slipped into the cave opening and shot a whisper into the dark. "We got company outside." Maeve glanced up from her notebook. "Human sure is. Walking the high rim. Haven't found the hideout yet. Maeve stood up smooth. She grabbed her thin blade less for drawing blood, and more because gripping steel helped a person think straight. Just one, sounds like it, full-grown, heavy boots, either a grown-up or one big kid. Now why would any kid be wandering this harsh mountain alone? Good point. Maeve studied her steel blade, made her choice, and left it on the stone. Let's go see. Clara gave her a long look. You really want to meet this stranger? I want to lay eyes on them before they stumble onto us. If we step out now, we command the high ground. She was already wrestling on her heavy winter coat. You coming? Clara threw hers on. They slipped out of that rock crack, side by side, pulling that same eerie trick that always gave the folks back in Dunmore Hollow the chills, the pair of them stepping out like ghosts from the exact same shadow matching step for step, wearing the exact same stone-cold look. Right then, that look was guarded dead level and about as friendly as a rattlesnake. Up on the ridge, the stranger froze. He was just a green kid, maybe 22 or 23, way younger than those heavy boots let on. And he had that raw, starved look a fella gets from fighting deep mountain snow for weeks. It's a mean kind of hollow that starts right at the face and just eats a fella inward. He wore thick, quality winter hides, finer than anyone down in Dunmore Hollow could ever buy, making him a mountain trapper. He packed a heavy kit, rifle slung back, keeping both hands in plain sight. Maeve saw that and respected it. He stared down at them for a long, quiet moment. You're alive, he said. He breathed it out like a man finally laying eyes on a campfire ghost he desperately wanted to believe in, but couldn't quite trust till now. Clearly, Clara said. They said... He froze up. He started again. Most people figured you were dead after the first week of that storm. Most people were wrong, Maeve told him flatly. Who are you? The boy clearly needed a second to steady his nerves. He gawked down at them in a raw kind of way, not outright rude, but far from civilized manners. Just raw shock. The kind a fella gets when cold reality shatters the heavy expectation he's been hauling around. Caleb Reed. I trap the upper northwest line. Have for 3 seasons. He just paused. I'm not from Dunmore Hollow. He choked up again. You just what? Clara pushed back. I heard what they did. His jaw clenched tight. The whole story came out in pieces. Silas Winter's version first, then some other versions. I was angry about it, is the truth. I kept thinking about it while I was running my line. He eyed the deep draw, the dark rock crack behind them, and finally the 2 women. I didn't really expect to find you. I just didn't want to go back to my cabin without looking. Now listen here. The 3 of them just stood freezing in that rocky draw, the wicked wind howling high above, while heavy snow buried the whole wide world. Maeve sized the boy up. She had a rough habit of staring at folks for a good long while before ever saying a word. Always made decent folks squirm. Down in town, she learned to hide it so the neighbors wouldn't spook. Up here on the mountain, though, she didn't hide a damn thing. Picture this. He held her gaze without flinching. That really meant something. Caleb Reed, she asked. How's the town? His face changed then. Something deep behind his eyes grew hard and real quiet. Bad, he muttered. Real bad. She shot a look at Clara. Clara looked right back. Step in out of the cold, Maeve offered. We'll make broth. He blinked, stumbling. There's a cave. He eased down that steep ravine wall, testing every single foothold. Once down, they guided the man right through the narrow slot and into the heavy warmth. Inside the opening, he froze up and stood dead still for a spell. Maeve watched the man size up the roaring fire, the sturdy shelter, those little growing plots, those 2 inches of green rye poking up the stone water trench, the row of tools he took in every single piece. She saw a familiar look wash over his rugged face. It was the exact same awe she'd felt on day 18, standing over that very first rye sprout. For a long while, he stayed completely quiet. "You folks built all this," he finally breathed. "We had time," Clara answered mildly, setting a pot of water over the flames. He settled down across the flickering fire and slowly drank the thin broth. It was real rabbit stew, now not just boiled bones. Clara tossed in young rye shoots, which made it damn good, while Caleb spilled everything he knew about the folks over in Dunmore Hollow. Town grain. Stores were running way lower than the council ever dared admit. A couple of the founding families lost their elders to the bitter freeze that first month, and one of the little Clay kids, the youngest, just barely 2 years old, had been fighting off some nameless sickness since right before the dead of winter set in. Hunting was downright miserable. Those trappers working the lower ridgelines dragged back less than half the pelts a normal, decent season ought to provide. He mentioned Silas Winter hadn't breathed a public word about his runaway nieces since they vanished. Not to clear his name, not to explain a damn thing. He stayed quiet, and the town folks seemed perfectly happy to let sleeping dogs lie. Maeve took it all in without making a single peep. Her face wore that careful, sizing up look. Clara just watched the dancing flames. You and I know that heavy silence. The cave sat totally quiet, just popping embers and howling wind outside. "How often do you run this trapline?" Maeve asked him. "Every 10 to 12 days, depending on the fierce storms. And you ride close by this here ravine?" "I can. It's barely a half-mile off my main trail." Slowly, she turned her eyes toward those green plots. Then she glanced at Clara, who was already staring right back. Those two had been having this exact silent conversation for a solid 20 years. They settled the matter in about 4 flat seconds. "Next time you pass through," Maeve told him straight, "bring some empty feed sacks if you got 'em. We'll have fresh rye to send back with you." Caleb Reed just stared at her. He looked hard at those 2-inch seedlings, pale but stubbornly alive, sprouting from cave dirt smack in the middle of the most brutal winter anyone could remember. A strange look crossed his worn face. Not exactly pure disbelief, but not quite wonder either. It was some wild mix of both that a man can't rightly put a name to. "You folks aim to feed the whole town," he muttered. "We're sure gonna try," Maeve nodded. "Head back this way in 10 days. Bring those empty sacks." He cast one last long look down at that green rye, then met her eyes. "I'll be back in 8, he told her flatly. Caleb made good on his word and returned in 8 days carrying 4 empty grain sacks folded up tight in his heavy pack. He also brought a little oilskin bundle of salt, setting it gently on the rock shelf near the fire without saying a single word. Just leaving a quiet gift without making a big fuss over it. That rye wasn't harvest ready yet, and he damn well knew it. He'd worked out the math riding the snowy trail back home, realizing those tiny little sprouts needed a sight longer than 8 days to turn into real grain. But the stubborn man showed up anyway. Maeve noticed his early return but kept quiet. Instead, he spent 2 solid hours helping Clara brace the eastern wall of that back cave chamber. That crumbling limestone wall had been dropping sharp little rocks right onto the outer crops. He had a natural, quiet way with his hands, the mark of a man who's survived years isolated in the rough back country. He just pitched in without being asked, and never bragged on his work later. Clara watched him work, wearing that careful look she got when rethinking a first impression. After he finally rode out, she muttered, "He's all right." "He sure is," Maeve agreed. "Honestly, I never expected the man to return." "Well, I sure did." Maeve sat making tallies in her rugged little ledger, logging that green rye. 3.5 inches in the main bed, 2.25 in the back room. He promised 8 days, and he meant it. Folks who mean what they say usually show back up. That's a mighty rare breed of people. "Sure is," Maeve agreed, which makes it worth noting. Stick with me here, because that trapper came back 4 more times over the next 3 weeks. Let me tell you, every time he visited that cave showed more progress, and he kept staying longer. Not 'cause the girls laid out a welcome mat, but 'cause frontier survival always needs an extra pair of hands, and he had 'em. By his fourth trip, that main patch of rye stood tall enough to harvest. Weren't no sprawling prairie crop lacking that thick, sun-baked density. But it was enough to get folks fed. Clara sliced it with her skinning knife, while Maeve held those stalks steady. Caleb just stood by the cave entrance, hands shoved in his pockets, carrying that heavy quiet of a man seeing something he flat out can't find words for. "How much?" he asked. Maeve bounced the fresh-cut stalks in her calloused hands. "Enough for a small loaf. Maybe a touch more if the grain fattens up like I reckon it should." She shot him a plain, hard look. "Who down in the settlement is hurting most?" He didn't blink. "The Clay folks, 4 kids youngest still ailing, and old Marta Weiss. She's been living on the Priestley brothers' charity since fall, and their own pantry is running mighty bare." "Start right there," Maeve said. "Just keep quiet about where this came from." He studied her face. "Folks'll piece it together eventually." "Eventually is just fine. Right now, I just want grub in their bellies before any proud townsfolk start wrestling with where it came from." Caleb stayed real quiet for a spell. "Yeah, I reckon. That's probably the right trail." He took the grain gentle-like, knowing damn well the blood and sweat it cost. "I'll ride straight there tonight if the weather holds." "It'll hold till dawn," Clara muttered from the shadows, never looking up from bundling the second harvest. "Air pressure's been dead steady for 3 days. You've got a clean window." He squinted at her. "How'd you figure that?" "The Rock Springs flow rate shifts right along with the barometric pressure. It's run smooth since Tuesday." She finally glanced up. "Plus, the ravine echoes differently. Low pressure dulls the wind. High pressure makes it crack." She kept tying stalks. "Out here, you and I know you read whatever the land gives you." Caleb just stared at Maeve. Maeve stared right back, her eyes plainly saying, "Yep, she's always like this. I know it, and don't you dare make a fuss." He gave a slow nod and grabbed his pack. That second crop came in 3 weeks after the first. Bigger, too, 'cause they reseeded fast, and the earth's natural heat in that main cave ran steadier than the side rooms. That deep dirt had finally settled down, caught its rhythm, and the rye shot right back up. Those turnips out on the edge were ripe for pulling, plump, firm, and crazy healthy for roots raised entirely in the dark. Clara yanked them up, looking mighty shocked, like even she didn't bet on them surviving. "They're actually good," she said, wiping off cave dirt and taking a bite. She kept chewing. "Real good." "You didn't think they would be?" "I figured they'd just be edible." "Good beats edible any day on the trail." She tossed the turnip to Maeve, who took a big bite. It was thick, a little sweet, and tasted like real, living food. Kept your soul warmer than the jerky and bone broth they'd been surviving on. Maeve finished her half quiet-like, which spoke volumes in itself. By the time Caleb rode back for the second run, they had 4 hefty bundles of rye, 14 turnips, and a good patch of cave moss. Maeve figured had enough iron to keep a body upright, loaded with minerals. Eats fine raw or dried, and it spread across that north stone so fast, scraping some off didn't hurt the patch none. She'd scratched out instructions on an old oilskin scrap, detailing how to cook the moss and its benefits, all in her tight, no-nonsense handwriting. Caleb squinted at the note. "Folks in town are gonna find this downright strange." "A starving man don't care much about strange," Maeve said. "Fair point," he agreed, folding the scrap and tucking it deep in his duster pocket. He stayed quiet a minute, packing those sacks with that same slow, deliberate way he handled everything. "That Clay girl is healing up, the youngest. Started taking food 2 days after I delivered that first loaf." Neither sister made a peep. "I just figured you'd both want to know," he murmured. Clara, standing with her back turned to check the new seedlings, froze dead still for a heartbeat. Then she went right back to work. Maeve softened. "We wanted to know. Thanks." "You and I know it was a quick exchange, but it sure wasn't a small thing." That routine carved itself in stone over the next month, holding as strong as anything forged out of pure, desperate frontier survival. Pull up a chair, partner. Caleb ran his trap line through that ravine every 8 to 10 days, bagging what was ripe and hauling it to the most desperate folks down in Dunmore Hollow. He never once spilled where the grub came from. Claimed he'd stumbled on an old winter cache. Later, he spun a yarn about a lucky trapper having a rich season and sharing the wealth. But as that haul got bigger, those tall tales got mighty hard to swallow. Eventually, he just clammed up and let folks guess. Those folks weren't quick to pry. When starvation knocks, people care a whole lot more about a full belly than where the meal actually came from. For a few weeks, that rough little settlement just took those deliveries with the pure, silent gratitude of a starving dog, never asking a single question. Caleb told those two sisters it was like the whole town agreed not to look a gift horse in the mouth, but that growing mountain of food was getting mighty tough to hide. That hidden back cave hit a massive harvest, by what Maeve reckoned was day 89. And those squash the ones she'd stubbornly held back until the dirt was prime, planting them with the deep patience of a true frontier farmer who knows the land takes no half measures. Well, they had finally done something she'd fiercely hoped for, even if she never dared to bet on it. The crop exploded. That perfect mix of sharp sunlight cutting through the rock-crack-rich dirt and dead steady warmth grew thick vines that crawled clean across that whole back cavern and yielded a bounty the way wild gourds do when they hit sweet soil, reckless and totally unrestrained. By the end of week 10, they had 11 massive, ready-to-pick squash resting right there on that stone floor. Clara just stared at them a good long while. Then she shot Maeve a look that was, well, for a stone-faced woman like Clara, mighty close to pure joy. 11, she muttered, plus whatever else sprouts these next 2 weeks before the winter chill hits. Maeve shot back. We can't eat 11 of these. No, we surely can't. Caleb needs a heavier sack. He's gonna need extra hands. Now that threw a wild wrench into the gears. They figured Caleb hauling solo was plenty enough, and for bags of grain and root crops, the Lone Rider Act worked fine. But 11 heavy squash, plus the steady rye, the turnips, and that moss, it was just too much for one man to smuggle quietly on foot, lugging it a half-mile off his usual hunting trail. Their whole underground operation was gonna have to shift, and they both knew a shift meant stepping out of the shadows. More folks discovering the food source, bringing a whole storm of messy trouble. Now, you and I know the frontier don't wait. They were hashing this out cold and level on day 92 when Caleb rode in early. He squeezed through that rock, slot faster than a spooked stallion, his jaw locked tight. He wore that grim, stiff mask of a man carrying bitter news, practicing his dark speech every mile of the trail. Maeve spotted that shadow right away and dropped her ledger. What happened? He snatched off his hat. There's a sickness in the settlement. Real bad fever, not just winter chill. It's tearing through the homesteads. Hit the preacher's cabin just 3 days back. By yesterday, 4 more kin groups caught the bug. Burning fevers. Some much worse. Clara spun around from the damp wall where she'd been inspecting moss. The little ones? Grown folks, too. Yeah, kids. He collapsed heavy onto a rock ledge. Silas Winter is riding cabin to cabin with the last scraps of medicine we got, which ain't much. He's looking mighty rough, honestly. Not infected. I reckon just rode hard and put away wet. That man's name hung in the damp cave air heavy as lead. Maeve watched Clara's spine stiffen like a rifle barrel. She felt her own hands press flat on her jeans. A strange flutter kicked up in her chest, a ghost of a feeling. Not the fiery anger she always expected when Silas's ghost was raised, and sure as hell not forgiveness. Just an old ache without a proper brand on it, which she decided to just leave unmarked. What supplies they got left? She asked. Some yarrow? Folks boiled the last willow bark back in January. Might be feverfew hidden somewhere, but nobody remembers who hoards it. That old healer Mrs. Thorne, she's laid out with it too, which makes this... He choked up. It's a bad hand we're dealt. Maeve stared hard at the rock, flipping through that old ledger in her mind. Her ma's exact frontier remedies, those wild medicine pages she'd memorized and stored away, just like she'd memorized Voss's dry rock surveys. Not 'cause she needed it back then, but 'cause we all reckon survival means hoarding every scrap of truth you find. "The cave moss," she whispered. Clara turned plumb around. "Fever-breaking properties." "Yeah, I figured the same. You and I know it won't replace willow bark, but it'll surely back it up." Now Maeve was already digging through her rucksack, yanking out that weathered ledger, hunting down the page. "Dried yarrow in our supply. Ma packed it deep with the healing seeds. I unearthed it back in week 2 and kept it safe." She glanced up. "I kept my mouth shut, seeing as we had no need for it then." "You held on to it," Caleb muttered. "I save things that count," she replied, already scratching out a list down the margin of that ledger. "How fast can you ride back to the settlement?" 3 hours if the snow holds firm, 4 if the trail's soft. "It's packed tight," Clara told him. "Pressure's holding." Maeve studied her list, then she locked eyes with Caleb, and then looked at Clara, making a hard choice she'd been dancing around for weeks without ever owning up to the tune. "You're bound to tell the folks she said exactly where this remedy is coming from. Every last bit." Caleb fell dead silent. "If we send this cure, those townsfolk must know the maker. They gotta trust it's true, and they need to know whose hands brewed it, so they understand the dosing ain't just blind luck." She met his stare. The truth was bound to break eventually. That harvest alone proved it. "I know," he whispered. "I know. I just—" He rubbed his tired neck. "I was hoping to hold off until the town was truly ready for it." "Folks are dying," Clara stated flatly. "Being ready ain't our worry right now." He looked between those two women, wearing the face of a scout trying to read a storm he couldn't quite figure out. "There's folks in that settlement who are gonna fight this hard." "I know it," Maeve nodded. "Silas Winter being the fiercest, and he's the very man most likely running the rationing for whatever provisions you haul back." "I reckon that too." Total silence. Just the campfire crackling away. "Do it regardless," Maeve ordered. "Give them the honest truth. The whole story." Caleb studied her face for a long second. It was that same unblinking, heavy gaze she'd seen on their very first day. Then he gave a single nod, stood tall, and held out his calloused hands for the medicine bundles. The town's reaction down in Dunmore Hollow didn't roll in all at once like thunder. Caleb carried the news back in fragments over his next 2 rides, and Maeve pieced that story together, the way she handled any hard labor, steady and methodical, never letting the heavy sorrow of those details twist the bigger picture. The cure went straight to the sickest cabins first, which was the only thing that truly mattered right then. Old Mrs. Thorne, barely fighting off her own bad fever, had inspected that cave moss mixture, the yarrow, and the careful dosing notes, and according to Caleb, she looked him dead in the eye, saying whoever penned those instructions knew their survival craft, and she demanded a name. When he told her, she didn't fuss, just stared at that ledger and muttered, "Well," with a heavy tone that spoke 1,000 unspoken miles. Now the folks who'd been getting secret rations, the Clays' Marta Weiss, and the ailing families, they already had their suspicions. The Clay mother had supposedly spoken up when Caleb finally confessed that she'd reckoned the truth for weeks, thanked the Lord, and saw zero reason to upset the wagon. Marta Weiss just wept, a detail Caleb relayed mighty awkwardly, since he couldn't rightly tell if it was joy or sorrow, and a smart man don't guess. But friend, the bitterest reactions came from elsewhere. Those priestly brothers, who hollered the loudest to run the girls out that cold January dawn, went graveyard quiet when they heard the honest truth. The distinct quiet, Caleb explained, of stubborn men trying to stay angry at the exact same miracle, keeping their little ones breathing. And Elder Print, the very councilman who cast his lot to banish them, well, he shut himself up in his cabin and didn't show his face for a day and a half. Now picture this. Silas Winter just stood dead center in the muddy street of Dunmore Hollow, taking in Caleb's whole tale, without speaking a solitary word. before walking slowly home. Folks who witnessed it swore he walked away like a man bearing a saddlebag too heavy to drop, yet entirely too heavy to keep on carrying. Maeve didn't pen a lick of this in her ledger. She just locked it away in her mind right beside the rest of her silent burdens. The land surveys the dirt-mixing ratios, the hardy rye sprout numbers, and that shameful look her uncle gave that January, staring empty space beside her head instead of looking her in the eye. She just let it steep. She wasn't ready to sort it out. The night after Caleb shared the news, Clara asked softly, "Are you holding up all right?" "Just thinking." "I know you are. That's exactly why I'm asking." "Gather round, friends." Maeve stared into the flames. "I want to feel clean about this. Just one pure emotion, but it's mighty tangled up." "Like what?" Clara asked. "Like—" Maeve paused. She caught her breath, "like how I'm truly glad that Clay kid recovered." "I'm relieved, but I can hold that alongside my blazing fury about what happened in January. Neither feeling kills the other. I just don't know how to carry both." Clara stayed dead silent for a spell. "You don't gotta do a thing. Let them both be true." Maeve sighed. "That sure sounds like something our mama would preach." She said pretty near the same thing once. Right after the mill council stole Papa's hard work, used his land assessment, and never gave him a lick of credit. She claimed you can be right burning, angry, and generous all at once. None of it contradicts. Maeve remembered that old memory. Faint, but present. She was maybe 12 back then. Didn't grasp it. She sure understood the harsh truth now. "She was right," she murmured. "Usually was," Clara replied. "Especially about things that counted." Now listen close. On day 107, Silas Winter showed his face up on that ravine. Maeve was fixing the light rig in the back when Clara's voice drifted from the main cave, steady and overly cautious. "Maeve, come here." She did. Clara stood by the cave mouth, right inside the narrow slot, staring upwards. Maeve followed her gaze. He stood up top. The man was alone. He wasn't walking with the steady, careful stride of a seasoned trapper who knew this rugged country. He stumbled like a bone-tired drifter, running purely on stubborn grit, fresh out of whatever energy he used to have. Every dragging bootstep a heavy choice building into a longer trail. He looked rougher than she figured. Not frozen, his coat was thick enough, but hollowed out from within. His face wore that sickly yellow-gray mask of a man who hadn't slept a wink. He'd dropped weight the way broad-shouldered fellas do when they stop eating right, making him look massive, yet completely withered away all at once. He spotted them, froze dead in his tracks. The sisters held still, the three of them locked in a standoff, feeling like an eternity. Two fierce women at the dark cave entrance, looking upwards. One desperate man on the rim, staring down, all caught in that bleak winter twilight, while the mountain carried on its cold, uncaring business around them. He scrambled down the cliffside. Wasn't pretty, neither. Slipped up twice on the rocky climb down, bracing his fall with bare hands both times. By the time his boots hit the dusty ravine floor, his palms were bloodied, gasping for air way harder than that climb should have demanded. He lumbered toward the sisters, stopped about 6 feet away, sizing up the rugged ravine. He eyed the narrow entrance, the packed snow ground, carrying the deep tracks of their boots. He felt that slight warmth you could catch out here if you just stood quiet and noticed. He faced them both. "Got 3 pioneer families down there with kids burning a fever." "Mrs. Thorne is healing up, but she's too weak to nurse them all. We burned through every remedy." "We know," Maeve told him. "Caleb spread the word." He finally met her eyes, something he avoided all January. She let him look. "I'm not." He choked up. Tried again, mighty careful, like a man rationing his last drops of water. "I ain't here to make excuses. I know my sins. I won't stand on this mountain and—" He clamped his mouth shut, his jaw clenched tight. "I'm begging for the families, not myself." The cavern stayed warm behind the girls. The ryegrass sprouted. The winter squash sat fat and practical on that back cavern floor, Now you and I know Maeve felt all that comfort behind her, staring at the man who banished them into the worst blizzard in 30 years. She felt that messy knot she'd been ignoring since Caleb mentioned his name finally unravel, turning sharp and clear. Wasn't exactly forgiveness. Not yet, maybe never in a pure, holy way, but it turned into something way past the need for pardoning, something a lot more useful and far more honest than grace. "Step inside," she said softly. "We'll pack up what we can." He just blinked. He never reckoned it'd be that easy. She saw it. He walked up here expecting a bitter fight. She almost told him that. Making him bleed wouldn't cure those sick youngsters. But she swallowed the words. It felt downright cruel, and she refused to be that kind of person. Not today. "Come on in," she repeated, a bit softer, stepping back to let the broken man through the rocky gap. Picture this. He stepped into that cave real slow, letting the heat thaw him out, like any half-frozen man would. You could see it happen, those stiff shoulders finally dropping down from where cold fear had pinned them. He sized up their off-grid setup, kept his eyes locked on those indoor crop plots, the rye, turnips, and that stubborn green moss creeping up the north rock face. He studied their little handmade shelter with that patched-up roof, the heavy stone windbreak, 2 worn bedrolls, the rigged tool wall, and a lone tin coffee cup swinging on a peg. He took the whole scene in, and Maeve watched him staring. She figured he was finally realizing the heavy toll this survival gig took. He was finally getting it. He kept his mouth shut about the rough setup. She sure did not press him on it either. "Tell me about the folks back home," she ordered, grabbing her field journal. Silas Winter sat across that fire from his nieces, delivering the grim news like a battlefield scout giving a war report. Names, sickness, signs, timelines. What remedies failed out there. That detached ranger tone was the only shield he had left after whatever hell he dragged himself through to arrive. Maeve kept writing. Clara sat perfectly still. Turns out 3 young ones were burning up with bad fevers. Oldest was a 9-year-old boy named Clem Farrow. His daddy happened to be one of those town leaders who cast that fateful January vote. A heavy truth that hung right there in the cave air, totally unspoken. Youngest was just 4, a little girl from the Wise cabin, Marta's granddaughter. She got snowed in when the blizzard hit and was now trapped, sick. The 3rd kid was 12. Old enough to be terrified, but young enough that terror made everything worse. 2 grown folks were laid out too. Older pioneers, already worn down by the brutal winter months. Maeve studied her ledger. She eyed that moss patch, the dried yarrow, and their meager rye bundles resting by the camp. She ran the harsh survival math right in her head, just the way she always figured odds calculating survival stats with some quick, quiet instinct her sister Clara had long stopped trying to figure out. "This medicinal moss patch buys us 3 days to break 5 fevers. If we brew it thick and strong," she told him straight. "After that, we rely on fresh growth, which falls short unless those fevers snap before day 4. "They usually crack by then," Clara chimed in. "If they stay burning past day 4, we are looking down the barrel of something much deadlier. And if we really face an outbreak that bad, our little moss remedy will not save those folks anyway." Now you and I know that bewildered look. Silas watched those 2 trade words like a greenhorn trying to follow a foreign campfire language. "What do you need me to do?" Maeve stared him down. It was the only proper question. Honestly, the first straight hooting sentence he had offered since crossing that threshold, and she respected him for stepping up. "Can you haul 4 heavy packs dead up and out of this rugged canyon?" "Yes, and deliver them to the right cabins within 2 hours flat. Caleb can help. He handles the town supply routes." "Good." "We pack the medicine clear of the rations. The treatment orders ride with the cure. Mrs. Thorne has to read my notes strictly. No guessing, no improvising. Follow them exactly. I will tell her. Tell her twice." A heavy pause. "I will tell her twice," he promised. Clara was already at the supply stash, moving fast without a single wasted motion. She measured out that healing moss, first on a flat river rock, bundling it tight into oilskin scraps. She marked every single pouch with dark charcoal. She moved with the sheer grit of someone surviving on, scraped together rations for 107 days, and she had gotten mighty good at the job. Maeve loaded up a grub next to it, their fresh rye grain, 6 winter squash, and the absolute last turnips pulled from the rough outer dirt, picked just that morning. Silas sat back and watched those women hustle. He did not offer a hand, which was probably his most honest move all hour. He reckoned the quiet working rhythm between these two tough sisters was tuned, so tight that a clumsy greenhorn jumping in would only wreck the gears. So he stayed planted. He studied that cavern, stared hard at their little rigged-up shelter, the heavy tool wall, and those thin bedrolls. You and I have seen that restless look. He stared at those dirt crop beds, gazing like a man who stumbled on a wild frontier miracle he cannot explain. Once he opened his mouth but held back. Maeve kept loading up the supplies. "You can go ahead and spit it out." A long, dusty pause. "I packed those bags the night before he confessed. The very ones I hauled to that door." "I know. Figured it out climbing that first ridge. Just needed you to hear that I knew it. I knew exactly what I was doing. Ain't gonna play the fool about it." Maeve set down the winter squash she was wrapping. She gave him a hard, steady look, just like that dead winter day in January when he wouldn't meet her eyes. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because." The man paused. His rough hands just curled tight against his knees. "Because saying I'm sorry, well, it just ain't enough. I know it falls short. And I didn't want to speak those words and have you thinking I believed they settled the score." The cave fell dead silent, save for Clara rustling through the provisions. Maeve just held his gaze for a long, heavy minute. She remembered fighting that first ridge in the blinding snow, and that second climb that was downright murderous. And Clara's voice claiming they'd survive, sounding half like a sworn promise, and half like a prayer he just desperately needed to say out loud. She thought on those 18 days, praying for a single rye sprout, and how that kind of waiting just aches deep in your bones. She pondered her mother's journal sitting barely 3 feet away in her pack. She'd studied those weathered pages so often, she knew them by heart. She reckoned, "He is dead right that it ain't enough. And he's right that admitting it is a sight more honest than playing pretend." "I know it ain't enough," she told him flatly. "But I ain't waiting around for enough neither." She picked up her squash and kept working. "Help me haul these to the cave mouth." He stood to pitch in, and for 20 long minutes, they toiled side by side without uttering a single solitary word. It wasn't comfortable in the slightest, nor was it resolved, and they weren't pretending otherwise, which Maeve figured was the very best they could manage right then. Out here on the frontier, honest truth was all she had left. Now you see, Silas rode out with Caleb. The man had showed up on the ridge while they packed, tracking Silas's trail and figuring their camp perfectly. So those 2 men rode out of that ravine, burdened with every provision the sisters could scrounge up, moving with that hard, desperate hustle of folks who know that their cargo might save lives, which you and I both know gives speed a terrible weight. Clara watched them ride out through the narrow gap. "That boy ain't going to be right in his head for a long spell," she murmured. "No," Maeve agreed. "Are you?" Maeve gave that a fair shake. "Don't rightly know yet. Try asking me come springtime." She paused for a breath. "I meant what I told him. I ain't waiting for enough. I just don't have the grit left to spend energy on holding a grudge. But that ain't the same as being all right." "No, sure ain't the same." She stared down the ravine at that crusted snow, looking up at that one thin slice of pale frontier sky. "But it's workable enough. I can surely work with that." Clara seemed to reckon that was fair and walked on back inside. Let me tell you, those next 12 days were the bitterest of the whole winter. though not from anything inside the cave. Truthfully, their little camp was running smoother than ever. That backroom squash patch was still yielding. The seeded rye in the main plot was sprouting quicker now that the dirt had settled in, and that thick green moss had crawled across almost the whole north wall, giving them a solid crop that hardly needed a lick of tending for what it gave back. Maeve started brewing up a second batch of medicine using that fresh moss and her very last scraps of yarrow, reckoning the town fever might turn deadly before it finally broke. She worked with that silent, steady grit that got her through the past 100 days, but there was a dark, coiled tension underneath it now that was brand new. A heavy waiting, like the thick air right before a wicked thunderstorm. That worry was all for the town for the ailing youngsters, and if their homemade tonic would do the trick. And whether Silas had properly read those notes twice to Mrs. Thorne, just like she ordered him to. And about Caleb, who hadn't rowed back yet, maybe staying clear because the dying had gotten worse, and he didn't want to drag that shadow up the mountain. On the 5th long day of waiting, Clara muttered, "You ain't sleeping one bit." "I'm sleeping just fine. You're lying dead still with your eyes shut, which is an entirely different beast." Maeve went quiet at that. "That 9-year-old boy, Clem Farrow, I keep thinking on him. His daddy cast a vote back in January. I know that's a big piece of it." She rolled onto her back, staring hard at the rocky ceiling. "I don't want that little boy dying just because his father is a yellow-bellied coward. That seems like a mighty unfair consequence. Children don't pass on because their daddies lack spine. They die because a bad fever takes them. I know that in my right mind. But I keep running the math on whether we sent enough down there and always come up short. Picture this." Clara stayed quiet a spell. Then she spoke up, laying her inner thoughts out plainer than she ever usually did. "I've been running those same hard numbers," she said, "getting a new answer every time depending on where that fever started." "Which we just do not know." "Sure don't know." The room stilled. "We fought it with every scrap we had." "God's honest truth. Don't bring much comfort, though." "No," Maeve answered her. "Sure don't bring much." They lay in the pitch dark, listening to the hearth, letting that grim math run its course. Because out on the trail, the only way out is straight through. On the 7th sunrise, Caleb rode in. He was moving faster than his usual tired amble, a pace Maeve knew well. And when he stepped through that door, his dusty face wasn't hauling sorrow. It was hauling something a whole lot more tangled an expression that took a slow minute to untangle. "The young ones?" she asked, quick. Fever broke in all 3. "Broke on day 4 for Clem Farrell, day 3 for the others." He slumped down. He looked bone-tired. That deep, soul-weary exhaustion that only comes after a brutal stretch of days that ask for too damn much. Mrs. Thorne swore by that herbal medicine. Claimed she had never seen a remedy work so mighty fine with such sparse supplies. She was asking where you learned such healing. "Our mother's old journals," Maeve replied. 14 solid years of her testing remedies. I figured as much and told her. She wants a parlay. Maeve just chewed on that. "When the dust settles some. Said to come when you're ready." He reached deep into his heavy coat, drawing out a small cloth-wrapped bundle, resting it real gentle on the stone hearth by the flames. He moved with slow, deliberate care like a frontiersman handed something mighty fragile, a man taking his sworn duty deadly serious. "Silas tasked me with bringing this here." Neither sister flinched for a long minute. Then Clara stepped over, lifting it up to peel back the cloth. Maeve watched her sister's weathered face do something she had not witnessed in many long seasons. A sudden, fleeting softness, quick as a drawn breath, caught and then locked away. Clara offered it. It was a little cloth-bound sketchbook, corners worn soft from years of heavy thumbing. The bottom right cover was dark with old frontier stains, maybe river clay or tough prairie soil. Maeve knew it before she even touched it. You and I know grief. She last spotted it by her mother's bed 7 winters back, the very morning of the burial, when Silas was pacing that cabin with the cold numbness of a broken man. packing away worldly goods because he just could not face the memories those goods held. She figured it was lost to the wind. She took it from Clara, holding it close, not daring to crack the spine right away. That worn cover felt exactly like she remembered. The fabric was sun-faded along the spine, but the heavy weight of it brought back sharp memories of her mother sitting by the cabin glass in the fading golden hour light, sketching in that peaceful, dead, quiet focus of a pioneer woman who had finally found her true earthly calling. Holding that book was like gripping a pure distilled piece of a bygone era. She opened the cover. Her mother had drawn the whole wilderness. Spring wilderness weeds, roots dug up and labeled with absolute care. That big ridge outside the cabin window drawn in 3 passing seasons, each sketch slightly altered, like she was tracking how the harsh weather carved the rock. A sketch of Maeve, at maybe 8 years old, captured sideways while she was studying some primer, hair wild and feet bare on those rough timber planks, drawn with the tender eye of a mother who saw the greatest beauty in plain, everyday frontier living. A few pages showed slices of deep valley dirt marked up with her tight, disciplined, pioneer handwriting. A picture of Clara fast asleep, mighty young, one hand laying open on the quilt. On the very last marked page sat a drawing of the high timberline, that northwest ridge, the steep gulches, and the pale limestone crags. Right beside it, scribbled in lead, 2 words: "They'll find it." Maeve just stared at that prophecy for a long, heavy while. Her mind drifted to the heirloom seeds, especially that cave moss wrapped up in paper. She chewed on Voss's land survey tucked in the journal. She pictured her mother, dead these 7 hard years, yet somehow still riding out ahead of them on the trail. She snapped the book shut. Clara was studying her. She knew, Maeve finally said. Her voice held firm, but only because she was drawing on that deep, iron resolve a pioneer saves for storms that would otherwise break them. She knew we'd need this survival knowledge, every last drop. Yes, Clara murmured softly. Think on that with me. She armed us for a fight she prayed would never come. Yes. Maeve tucked the sketchbook into her pack right beside the journal. Picture this. She pressed her hand flat on that pack. Then she squared her shoulders, eyeing Caleb, who'd been sitting dead quiet, showing the respect of a man who knows he's witnessing something mighty private. Did Silas say anything when he handed you this? No, Caleb said. Just handed it over and told me to make sure it got here. Maeve simply nodded. She turned to the hearth, tossing on a fresh log. Watching those flames catch that plain, honest science of burning timber grounded her right back in the present moment, exactly the way she needed. How's the town faring now? She asked. They passed the worst of that sickness. Caleb leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Honest truth? Always. Scraping by better than 2 weeks back. The rations you've been sending really saved those hardest-hit families. But bellies are still hollow. The cold still bites, and folks are... He paused, hunting for the right word. Folks have been trapped inside their own heads for weeks. Makes them restless. Clara chimed in. I was gonna say brittle, but yeah. He threw a steady glance at Maeve. Rumor is they want to haul the town's last seed stores up to this cave for the spring planting. He spoke, careful-like, studying her face. It ain't an official proposal yet. You and I know how folks get. They're beating around the bush, dancing around the truth that you hold secrets they desperately want to learn themselves. The fire popped. A burning log settled. Who's doing this talking? Maeve asked. Mrs. Thorne, a few of the younger homesteaders, the Clays. A heavy pause. Council ain't involved yet, but those old boys haven't been calling the shots lately anyway. Maeve shot Clara a look. Clara stared right back. A silent conversation lasting 6 seconds. They'll do the work themselves, Maeve finally said. We can teach them the ropes, but we sure can't run a second outfit from way up here. They gotta scout their own claim and break their own dirt. Takes solid weeks of hard labor before you even sow a single seed. I know, Caleb said. Reckon they do too. And they gotta trust our word is based on the hard dirt reality. It can't go through elder print just picking whatever sounds pretty to his ears. Elder print. Caleb muttered carefully. Has been keeping his mouth shut lately. Good. Let the old fool stay quiet. You could see the gears turning in her head. Her hardened practical side took the reins from her feelings, pushing them right into workable territory. That high pasture south of the hollow. There's a solid limestone ridge up there with a natural overhang. We spotted it while scouting the land. If that dirt underneath is what I figure, it could hold an above-ground cold frame setup by late March. Smaller than our claim here, but quicker to build since they'd get direct sun. Clara chimed in. You'll have to test that soil first. Yep. Meaning someone from this cave rides down to the hollow. Silence fell. Or folks from the hollow travel here. Both options hit like a lead anvil. Send someone down to the hollow. Maeve Winter, a woman cast out from Dunmore on a bitter January morning, marching right back through the frozen teeth of winter, just to check the dirt for the folks who exiled her. Or the other hand, Dunmore Hollow, trekking up here to the sanctuary they carved out to learn. Caleb stayed quiet, letting them chew on it. Clara finally spoke up. I reckon they ought to come here. Maeve eyed her. Let 'em see it, Clara insisted. Not just taking our handouts and written directions. Make them look at what we raised up from the dust and the grit it took. Her voice wasn't harsh, just ringing clear as a struck bell. Not to rub their noses in the dirt, but to show the raw labor. Folks only respect what they witness. Maeve chewed on that thought. We've all seen that look, ain't we? She pictured Silas stepping into that cave, seeing those sturdy beds, realizing the true hellish weight of what he'd asked them to survive. She recalled Caleb on his first run up here, lingering by the cavern mouth, with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his weathered face caught halfway between pure shock and quiet awe. You're right, she reckoned. I know it. Don't get a big head about it. Ain't bragging. I'm just right, and that's a whole different animal. Maeve near-about cracked a smile. She looked over at Caleb. Tell whoever's jawing about those seed stores to send 2 folks up here in 5 days. Folks who can sweat. And more importantly, folks who'll actually listen. Not the council, not elder print. Real working folks. Old man Clay knows soil, Caleb said. Worked the lowlands before he came up. Good. Him and one other. She paused. And make it clear they are coming to learn, not asking for handouts. That is a mighty big difference, and I want them knowing exactly which it is before they ride up. Caleb just nodded. He stood up and did that quiet thing he'd taken to doing lately. Neither sister ever asked or mentioned it. He took a fast look at their supplies, figured what was running dry, built a list in his head, and planned to haul up whatever he could next trip. He started that habit around his 3rd visit, and never quit. The girls kept quiet, because there was nothing to say but thanks. Out here pitching in was the only thank you that mattered. He tipped his hat on stalling at the cave mouth. Silas asked me a question. He muttered, keeping his back turned. Wanted to know if I figured you girls would ever head back down to the hollow. The cave went dead silent. What did you tell him? Maeve asked. Told him I reckoned that was your business to decide. He paused. He just said yes. That was it. Just yes. Then he slipped through the rock slot. His boots crunched up the rough ravine wall until the mountains swallowed the sound. Now listen to me. Maeve sat by those coals a long while. That sketchbook rested in her pack. The rye was shooting up right out of the dirt, and that old mountain kept doing its slow, stubborn work all around them. Cold and indifferent outside, but holding warmth in its secret hollows. She thought about her mama's pencil. They will find it, written with absolute certainty long before they actually held it. She chewed on what it meant, having someone who loved you lay out a trail for you, the raw, aching grace of a love practical enough to stare down a brutal frontier. Packing survival gear for a terrible future it prayed you would never face. She finally thought about heading down that mountain. But not yet. Old Man Winter wasn't through with them, and they still had hard chores left. Sickness was still tearing through families below, and Arthur Clay was riding up in 5 days. He needed to learn this survival farming before the hard earth thawed. There were still honest chores left up here, real tough work that mattered. But it sure crossed her mind. Across the crackling flames, Clara did not look up from the moss she was picking. "I know exactly what you are thinking." "I know you do, and—" Maeve stared into the embers. "And spring is rolling in?" Clara held quiet for a beat, then whispered, "Yes, it sure is." The fire kept burning on. "You and I know out there the snow was drifted deep. The bitter cold had weeks left to bite, but that winter rye was finally shooting up. Down in that secondary chamber, the squash sat round heavy and full of western promise. Green moss crawled up the north rock face. Stubborn as their mama promised, stubborn as those 2 girls had been, and stubborn as they aimed to stay. Spring was bound to break. They had survived this long. They would ride it out the rest of the way. Like clockwork, Arthur Clay showed up 5 days later, hauling a younger fellow named Pell Danzy along. Pell had the calloused hands of a boy who'd been busting up dirt since he was big enough to grip a shovel. He wore the tight jaw of a man told to keep his mouth shut for the whole ride up, and he was giving it an honest try. Old Arthur stopped square at the cave mouth and did what every newcomer did. Froze up, soaked in the heat, and stared at the crops. But his look was different. He studied it the way a seasoned rancher judges another man's pasture, sweeping the whole landscape first, then zeroing right down into the gritty details. Sizing up dirt color, crop health, and seed spacing, with the exact same gut instinct he trusted on his own acreage. Without so much as asking, he squatted by that rye bed. If you and I know anything about farmers, you know what he did next. Drove 2 fingers straight into the edge dirt, pulled them out, and read that damp earth. "You amended this dirt heavy," he grunted. "Native earth was pure, dense clay," Maeve fired back. "Too much alkaline off that limestone. Took 6 brutal weeks of working it before any rye would reliably sprout." "What did you mix in?" "Limestone dust off the rock, rotting leaf matter from the ravine, and wood ash cut with water to level the soil chemistry." Arthur rubbed that rich dirt between his thumbs once more. "How long before the mix actually took?" 3 weeks before the dirt was steady enough to take a seed. Another 2 till the sprouts came up steady. She held up. "The earth's own heat does the heavy lifting. Mixing the soil handles the food and the water drain. 2 different beasts." He raised his eyes to hers. "You and I know this kind of man. 40s, straight-shooting face, weathered like an old trail map, carved by bitter freezes, lean harvests, and lately the brutal scarring of a winter that simply pushed past a man's natural limits. I owe you an apology," he told her. Spoke it the way dirt farmers chew on hard truths, flat out, no theater, dead in the eye. "My kin was out on that road come January. I kept my mouth shut." Maeve studied the man a quiet second. "I know. I've been wrestling with how a person lives with a thing like that. You finding peace with it?" He let out a dry, raspy breath that sure didn't have any humor in it. "Not much." "Then quit trying to make peace with it," she told him, "and put that heavy guilt to some honest work. No malice there, just straight shooting." "You showed up. That's a start." "Learn this dirt. Take it back. Teach every soul who'll listen. Beats stewing in your own regret." He held her steady gaze. "Yes, ma'am." He said it without a lick of sarcasm or surrender. Just a plain, hard-earned respect, seeing things for what they were. The way a man tips his hat to the most honest words spoken all winter. After that, they rolled up their sleeves. 2 solid days of frontier schooling. Clara held down the fort in the back room, keeping the fires burning, while Maeve marched Arthur and Pell through the whole operation. The dirt mixtures seed depths those light reflectors, the moss growing, and reading the earth's deep heat. Spotting that heat hidden in pale limestone rocks and managing the water flow, tracking the sprouts and knowing a strong fighting route from one that was giving up the ghost in the dark. She passed it down exactly like her own mother did. Never talking down from a high horse, expecting true grit, and sharing freely like a pioneer who knows a good map only gets more precious when you hand it to a neighbor. Now Peldancy had kept his jaw shut tight the whole first sunrise. But come the second morning, he finally piped up with a question. It was a mighty fine question, sharp and grounded, asking if the soil recipe ought to shift for a sunny, south-facing ridge where water ran off differently. Maeve laid out the whole answer, then fired back a question about the dirt down at South Meadow. The quiet boy answered sharper than a fresh-stropped blade, and for the next hour, they traded thoughts like two seasoned hands realizing they both knew the same wild trail, just from riding it in opposite directions. Arthur just stood back and watched the dust settle. By the end, a quiet grin tugged at his mouth. When they rode out that second evening, their saddlebags were heavy with good, rich earth treatments, lively little starts right from the rye and turnip patches, plenty to stake out a brand new patch down in the meadow alongside 12 handwritten pages. Maeve scratched down everything they learned, plus a few deep thoughts she stirred up doing the midnight watch, and added before sunup. She inked those pages knowing the whole valley would see them. They'd get passed around the campfire, studied hard, and no doubt fought over fiercely. So she kept her words plain as a wooden fence, rock solid, leaving out any fancy guesswork. Arthur pulled his boots to a halt at the narrow exit, cast his eyes back across the cavern one last time. You and I both know that look. Staring hard at a miracle to make absolutely sure it's real and not just a desert mirage. Those sturdy rye beds, the thick green moss, a crackling hearth fire, 2 simple bedrolls, a rock shelf, iron tools hanging neat, a single tin coffee cup. All of it carved out of nothing but a skinning blade, a hand axe, some rope, and 112 brutal days. "My lady sent me with a message," he rumbled out. Said that loaf of bread we fetched back in February was the sweetest she's tasted in 2 long years. He slipped through the gap before Maeve could even chew on those words, right on purpose. Maeve anchored her boots in the warm cavern dirt, letting the sheer weight of that truth settle in. A tiny, quiet speck of everyday grace. Best bread in 2 hard years. She felt something loosen up inside her ribs. Nothing loud, just a quiet shifting of the season. From the back room, Clara hollered out, "What'd the old-timer say?" "Said his wife took kindly to our bread." Silence stretched. "That's real nice." "Yeah," Maeve agreed. "It surely is." You see, spring doesn't just kick the saloon doors open suddenly. Up high, winter lets go slowly, the exact way a stubborn man gives up a bitter grudge. Mighty slow, with setbacks. Picture this. You get weeks of good thaw, then a late blizzard hits, wiping it out, making you doubt spring is ever coming to this high country. A mean storm hit come early March, dumped 2 foot of fresh powder right in that ravine, plunging the mountain chill back to dead of winter cold for 6 brutal days. Now Maeve lay on her bedroll that second night. She felt that rock shelter trap the fire's heat right around her, thinking, this wilderness camp is still enough. No matter the storm outside, it's enough. That tempest finally broke. The great melt started again, agonizingly slow. Icy water trickled down the gorge in thin threads. Over the weeks, it swelled into a real rushing mountain creek. The heavy snowpack along those canyon walls crept back by the foot. One dawn, Clara headed out to check their trapline. She returned without ever reaching those snares, just standing near the cave, mouth wearing a look Maeve hadn't seen in many long months. "What is it?" Maeve asked. "Step outside," Clara replied. She did. The sky high above the ridge was blue. Not that harsh, icy blue of a bitter winter day. This was that rich, true western sky telling you the high country had finally decided to thaw out. A color with real sun behind it. The towering pines were dripping wet. Somewhere past the ridgetop, a bird started singing. A proper spring bird, mind you, not a winter scavenger. Something that migrated back. They stood in the dirt, just staring up. 138 days, Maeve murmured. You kept count. I never stopped counting. Clara tilted her head way back, drinking in that sky. We ought to head down into the valley, she said plainly. No rush in her voice, just straight frontier fact. I know it. Not today. Maybe soon. I know, Maeve repeated softly, her eyes locked on that open heaven. That little songbird kept right on. The creek kept rolling. This rugged world was quietly fixing to get warm all over again. They finally made the descent 11 days later, not for good. They understood that, plain as day, between them no long campfire talks required. That rocky outcrop wasn't something they were abandoning behind. It was a frontier claim they were building out from. It was their home base, a proper off-grid homestead that needed steady tending clear through the coming spring planting and beyond. Stick with me here. They weren't leaving it behind. They were finally choosing to bridge their wild camp with the valley below. Old Caleb walked down beside them. He offered, and they took his help without fuss. He knew that mountain pass best. He had been their only lifeline to civilization all winter, so it was only fitting he'd be the man to guide them back down the trail. The trail descending that. Peak sure looked different than the brutal climb up back in January. Changed, physically speaking. That harsh winter track was buried months back. Now they hiked the soft, muddy spring version of that same passage, hearing the wild creek rumbling faintly down in the hollow. The timberline parting ahead to reveal the great basin. But the journey had shifted in another profound way. It just wasn't about the dirt under their boots. The folks walking it weren't the same. Soft greenhorns who hiked up on a freezing January morning, carrying just 2 rucksacks and 5 whole days of dried jerky. Maeve chewed on this thought all the way down, wondering what truly hardens a person and what doesn't. She pictured the girl she used to be, standing in that cabin doorway, catching the grim look on her uncle's face, swallowing her fear and keeping her mouth shut. Then she thought of the woman sitting across a campfire from that very same fella 107 hard days later, barking orders to pack away her journal for Caleb to haul out. She weighed the vast canyon between those 2 moments and what forged her in between. What happened was she learned her true grit. Not like some flashy hero in a dime novel, not the fairy tale where somebody finds their courage rides tall in the saddle and never sheds a tear over the dark shadows that haunted them before. You and I know the harsh frontier never writes stories like that. The truth she uncovered was quieter, tougher than boot leather. She learned she possessed real bushcraft skills and undeniable capability, and when tested against brutal survival elements with actual life-or-death stakes in a wild place that never forgives a mistake she simply did not break, she bent in the wind, she grew dog-tired, and she got spooked in the dark sometimes, even cursed the dirt, shedding a quick tear around day 30 when those frontier turnips wouldn't sprout, and she couldn't fathom why. Every last bit of it. But she kept pushing down the trail. Knowing that about yourself means a whole lot. From the high ridge, Dunmore Hollow looked unchanged, but walking into it felt entirely different. It had that usual mountain town look. The mill, the buildings, and how the dusty main street caught the afternoon sun right between the highest roofs. Let me tell you, a town shifts when you've been gone long enough to truly look at it, rather than just passing through. Now she saw the harsh winter's toll plain as day, dwindling timber stacks and the church fence bowing down heavy under all that snow load. That ragged look a settlement gets when folks just survive a freeze instead of prospering. She saw the townsfolk much clearer too. Mrs. Clay stood in her doorway as they rode in. She eyed Maeve and Clara with a pure, plain relief that was near enough to shock a body. "You're all right," she said. It wasn't a question, just the honest truth she'd been aching to see for herself. "We're all right," Maeve answered. The little Clay girl rested easy on her mother's hip. The youngest child, the one who took sick back in February. She stared at Maeve with that bold honesty only kids have, buried her face in her mother's coat, then peeked out once more. Pell Danzy stood across the dirt road with 2 ranch hands. He tipped his hat when he spotted them, A true nod from a man who'd bled and sweated alongside them. Maeve nodded right back. Hearing the commotion, Mrs. Thorne stepped onto her porch 3 doors down. She looked a fair bit older than Maeve pictured from what Caleb used to say. Tiny, with eyes like a hawk. She moved mighty slow, like a body recovering from a hard sickness, and still testing how much her boots could hold. She sized up both sisters with the cold eye of the town's lone medicine woman. For 30 years, she'd been staring right through folks, cutting past whatever brave face they put on. "The cave moss compound," she called out instead of hello. "Our mother's formulation," Maeve answered her. "She was a careful woman." She surely was. "I'd like to properly learn that medicine prep from you whenever you got a minute." "I'll make time," Maeve promised. She meant it deep down in her bones, the way she always did when a path laid out true. Elder Prent was nowhere to be seen. Maeve noted the missing man, but kept quiet. Frankly, it didn't mean a lick. What counted was standing right there in Dunmore Hollow under that early spring sun. It was a pale, brisk light, but it carried a real western warmth at the edges. This camp wasn't the bitter place it was back in January, where it truly mattered. The folks eyeing her now weren't the same cowards who hid behind glass watching her leave. You and I know how a harsh season changes a soul. They bore the winter's heavy scars, finally realizing what they'd wrongly tolerated. Most hadn't figured out how to shoulder that guilt yet, and probably wouldn't for a long spell. She understood that completely. Truth is, she didn't know how to carry it either. Silas Winter stood down at the far end. He hadn't approached her. He kept to his side of town, and she reckoned why. He was handing her the reins. It was the only honorable move after a long trail of sins. She could just ride right past him. She could tip her hat from afar and leave it at that. She held all the cards now, and he just stood there expecting absolutely nothing in return. She walked straight toward him. He looked like a fella who had survived a brutal frost and a merciless reckoning all at once. It broke him down. He stood tall, but that posture took sheer grit. He watched her stride up without flinching. His weathered expression never changed, mostly because that heavy sorrow had set into his bones too deep to wash away fast. She stopped right in front of him. Up close, he looked miles older than January. Not just winter's bite, something deeper. Stick with me here. It's that kind of aging that strikes a man forced to face his own dark reflection without blinking. The sketchbook got there. She brought it in, he said. It did. I should have. It was always yours. Hers and then yours. Yes, she simply replied. He studied the dirt a second, then met her eyes. Arthur Clay says the South Meadow site should be workable by mid-April. He's already started the soil amendment process. I know he wrote to tell me. He thinks. A lot of folks think you should be the one teaching the spring planting method. Not just writing it down, actually teaching it. I know that too. The fella just fell completely silent. She let him stew in it. She hadn't walked down this dusty street to coddle the man. But she wasn't there to twist the knife, neither. She came out because that sketchbook earned a nod, and her mama always raised her to pay respects where respects were rightfully due. Plus, she'd just spent 4 grueling months carving something real out of a dark cave, and that survival farming gave her a backbone she wasn't about to lose. You know how that goes. I don't know how to fix it, he mumbled quietly. Weren't begging for help, just shooting straight. A new trick for him, she reckoned. You can't fix it, she said. You can do better with what's in front of you. That's all anyone can do with the things they've already done wrong. He stared hard, jaw clenching. You sound like your mother. Good, she said. She was usually right. She held his gaze 1 beat longer, then spun on her heel, marching back up the trail toward Clara, Caleb, and Mrs. Thorne. They were hashing out cave moss prep, talking plain and focused like pioneers who just spotted a mighty stubborn problem they aimed to conquer, and she stepped right into that campfire circle of talk. Let it carry her, and never looked back. Come the 14th of April, that South Meadow cold frame was finally planted. Maeve drew the blueprints. Arthur sweat out the labor, and Pell Dancy wrestled the soil. By week's end, 12 whole souls were out there working, learning how to mix dirt right and read the harsh meadow sun, studying planting depths, crop markers, and figuring out when ground was ripe for seed versus when it needed resting. Maeve walked the rows answering questions and fixing mistakes, never making folks feel like total fools the way her mama used to do. And let me tell ya, when those very first seedlings punched through that tough meadow dirt, and the greenhorn who planted them squatted down to stare, she felt that same deep pride as back in the cave on day 18 watching Clara. She realized that teaching actually multiplies your own harvest of knowledge. Not just tossing seeds of wisdom to the wind, though. That sure counted too. But more so, breaking a chore down for someone else forces you to know it absolutely bone deep. And all the steady questions folks asked Arthur's questions, Pell's questions. Even the young hands wandering out to the meadow, half doubting, but mighty hungry to learn a true pioneer skill. Those questions forced her to sharpen her farming methods far beyond what she and Clara ever needed alone in that dark cave. Clara actually brought this very thing up one crisp morning, right when they hiked down from the rocks and stood by the crop lines, just watching folks sweat. "You're better at it than I thought you'd be." "The teaching. With people. You were always—" Clara paused, hunting the word. "You were always careful in town, held back." "I was afraid of making things worse," Maeve said. "I know, but you're sure not doing that now." Maeve eyed the dirt plot, catching Pell showing a green young fella the right angle for a sun reflector. "I think I quit worrying about whether these folks liked me," she said. "Somewhere in that dark cave, I flat ran out of energy for it, and I just never picked it back up." Clara chewed on that. "That might be the handiest thing that bitter winter gave you." "The winter gave us plenty of things." It did, but most demanded the hard suffering first. Now you and I know that was the God's honest truth. They just stood by that meadow in the April sun, letting it be true, without sugarcoating a single thing. They spent their remaining years working that mountain, though not always up in that cave. That cave just became one outpost in a much bigger frontier. A whole string of crop setups that finally included the meadow frame, and 2 more hot spring sites they tracked down later using Old Voss's survey and their own hard-earned grit. Eventually, they built a mighty fine glass house by the hollow. Families traveled from valleys out yonder just to learn the survival farming those Winter sisters were preaching. They kept a town room eventually, slept there in harsh winters when cave access was too iced over. But that cave stayed the beating heart, that warm north wall and its moss colony, the main rye plot, and that back cavern where squash somehow survived that first brutal off-grid winter. Mrs. Thorne and Maeve spent 3 years forging their mother's remedy journal into a real wilderness survival guide, adding Thorne's 30 years of frontier wisdom. That homesteader's ledger outlived them both. It got copied down and carried across the valleys by settler families they'd taught. Caleb Reed, who originally stumbled upon them running his trap line, ended up laying claim in the Northwest Range. He finally raised a proper cabin just a short walk from that ravine. He kept running those traps, though. Kept visiting that cave year-round, not packing in rations anymore, but because a man's drawn back to the very soil where his life actually meant something. He never said it outright, never had to. Arthur Clay's youngest girl, the sickly kid from February, the one who used to stare down Maeve from her mama's, hip with pure frontier grit, grew up working that high meadow. She ended up knowing more about freezing weather farming than any old-timer in the territory. She's the one who finally put their whole homesteading method to paper, organized it right. So the knowledge survived even when neither sister was around to teach it. Folks said she had a real knack for breaking down tough wilderness lessons without making you feel foolish. They reckon she learned that directly from Maeve Winter. Silas Winter hung on 8 more winters. He didn't magically turn into some redeemed saint either. He was just a man who'd committed a grave wrong, knew it, and carried the heavy weight of that guilt exactly the way a broken man does. As a deep, permanent exhaustion buried right behind his eyes, and he'd break his back on chores working twice as hard, like sweat and manual labor were all he had left to offer this world. He rode up to that cave twice more for heavy lifting, barely muttering a word beyond what the tough job demanded. That second trip, Clara poured him a cup of wild bergamot and moss tea they'd finally foraged back in their third brutal summer. He took it, sat by the hearth, and they just shared that heavy silence of folks who've buried the hatchet, got nothing left to say, and are completely all right with that truth. He passed on during the fall of year 8, laid down his burden right in that cabin where he'd packed up before the blizzard, a fact Maeve thought on once, then buried for good. She rode out for the burial, though, stood out on the fringe without saying a word, afraid she'd speak the wrong one. But she showed up. Clara stood right alongside her. Like he said, and you and I both know this, folks rarely mention this when spinning. Tales about pioneers building from absolutely nothing. Building a homestead doesn't magically erase the harsh reality of that suffering. That freezing winter was still deadly. A bitter January morning stayed bitter. Hauling over that second ridge was still hellish. The jerky still vanished by day 6, and Clara still snared her first rabbit on day 9, with a deep guilt that lasted exactly 30 seconds before starvation took over. Success doesn't wash away that kind of pain, but the aftermath was real. The lessons held. The cold frames the warm springs. The frontier medicine that hard-won survival knowledge soaked into this valley like a slow autumn rain, forever changing the soil. Every ounce of it, real, built from honest dirt, not some invented pioneer myth. But Maeve Winter never forgot the hard truth she wouldn't have found that refuge unless she'd been driven there by force. She didn't dwell on it much. Dwelling didn't plow fields, and she was a woman of action, but she knew it. Carried that memory like a jagged piece of flint, real careful, fully respecting its edge, never dropping it just because it cuts, but never pretending it's smooth either. Listen closely, because what she learned over decades of teaching greenhorns, folks showing up with seeds, questions, and that desperate look of pioneers needing to believe that harsh frontier living could still yield a good life, was this. Knowing the promised land is real doesn't shield you from the brutal toll of the trail. That toll never vanishes in the rear view. The bleeding and the building happen at the same time, and you've got to shoulder both. How you bear that heavy pack is the only choice you truly own out west. She chose to build, and she kept making that choice every single sunrise until her dying day. Pull up a chair. When they passed, Clara went first. Early winter of a mighty quiet year up in that cave by the warm north wall. The moss still green beside her. Maeve followed 11 months later, just as the first autumn chill bit. Down in town, she watched that high peek out her window. The whole Pioneer Valley turned out. Not just to grieve, mind you, or shed tears. Folks gathered the way you visit a mentor, coming back to the very souls who taught them Western survival skills they relied on daily. It was a messy gratitude, equal parts pure heartache and deep respect. That exact debt you owe somebody whose hard-earned wisdom kept your own kids from freezing to death. Arthur Clay's girl stood up. She spoke on the wilderness knowledge she'd received the rugged folks who passed it down, and how she aimed to use it. She spoke plain and straight, just like a true pioneer. That old mountain cave wasn't boarded up or forgotten. No, sir, it kept thriving. Come spring, the valley folks who learned their ways sowed that main chamber's winter rye again. Meanwhile, that green moss on the north wall kept up its slow, steady crawl. And that back cavern with its cracked rock ceiling kept catching that sharp midday sunbeam. Their old survival sketchbook found a home in the settlement's tiny makeshift library, just a room in the clay cabin holding their medical logs, teaching papers, and a handwritten copy of Calder Voss's old land survey somebody had the good sense to keep. Now, you and I know That final page drew folks the most. The high peak's northwest corner, the craggy limestone ridges, and 2 penciled words. They'll find it. Over the next few decades, those winter cold frames spread across the homesteads, folks tweaking the design but sticking to the sisters' ironclad logic. Settlers who never even knew the sisters' names mixed that soil exactly right, blind to the history, just like swinging an old, heavy axe that's been in the cabin so long nobody cares who forged the iron in the first place. Truth is, that's exactly what Maeve wanted all along. Not the glory, but the legacy. Her harsh wilderness lessons, surviving long after she passed on, taking root in dirt she never walked, worked by rough hands she'd never shaken, through brutal blizzards she'd never face, but had forever made just a little easier to survive. Makes you think. The rugged mountain held warmth in hidden spots. The wild rye kept growing.